Well, he Oppenheimer briefed Eisenhower, I believe, in the I want to say early period. I want to say February or March, and one of the key recommendations was that, well, if the Russians didn't understand that what they needed to knock us out, they might go earlier than they should, or they might go at any time once they got the number, and we might do the same. And therefore, we needed to talk to one another to understand why, instead of two men in a small room with machine guns, it was more like two scorpions in a bottle. Now, what happens with scorpions when they sting is they die. And the argument was, well, the first strike would be devastating against, the United States, but we'd still somehow be able to get back a few bombers, and we would wipe out Moscow and lots of people. So it was, we needed to talk to one another to understand this and not get too carried away with the exact timing of when either got a knockout blow, and maybe even agree not to have as many bombers and fissile material to have a knockout blow on either side. It was about this time, in August of '53, a little later, that the alarm clock, or the layer cake bomb, which was, I believe, what was it, 400 kilotons, something like that, which seemed like it was a thermonuclear device that, a pure one. It wasn't, went off. And of course, Eisenhower took this Oppenheimer recommendation seriously and created something called Operation Candor. And he put, I think that, what was the next slide? Yes, this fellow, C.D. Jackson. He put him in charge of writing a bunch of speeches that would somehow tell the American public what was coming, that there would be a critical date, and both sides would be, and everybody, would be able to do terrible things to one another, and that we should avoid this. But somehow, this, every time they wrote a draft, everyone wrung their hands and went, God, that sounds awful. Let's keep working on it. They did put out one speech in April from some newspaper editors. I want to say it was in April, and that speech made some reference to, um, stockpiles growing larger and the need to cap them, but it was very vague. And then Joe 4 occurred. It was supposedly at this time, according to Eisenhower's memoirs, that he got this idea. And as best I can tell, it was his idea. And it was sort of the idea that was in the panel of consultants in NSC 68, that if you could cap what the other side was doing, you could avoid either side getting a knockout blow. But I think the way Eisenhower was thinking is, well, what if we, since we're now producing lots of uranium, enriched uranium, contributed to a bank that would promote civil nuclear activity, and goaded the Soviets to match us? We could beat them. They would only run themselves white contributing, and it would keep them from getting a knockout blow capability, but we would still have the upper hand because of our superior production capacity. I mean, that was never written out anywhere, but I think that's what was going on. In any case, that led to the next slide. Oh, this is something else that kind of interesting. The other major player was this fellow, Louis Strauss, and he figures very largely in the drama with Mr. Oppenheimer. They did not get along. Let's just say that. And Strauss actually ended taking Oppenheimer's clearance away with a number of other people, which pretty much ended Oppenheimer's career as a public policy figure. Also personally, apparently destroyed the guy. The In any case, Strauss was the head of the Atomic Energy Commission. He was made that when it was created. And, he was skeptical of this idea of Eisenhower's, which was, if we both give X to a bank, we can bankrupt them and still be able to keep going. Eisenhower, of course, didn't frame it that way. He said, well, it would keep us from getting a knockout blow stockpile, or at least the Russians, excuse me, and it might be worth a try. Strauss said, well, you sure? I mean, with thermonuclear weapons, the importance of the fissile material becomes relatively less with regard to yield. And he made some prevarications, but it became very clear that Eisenhower was eager, and Strauss took back his objections and started to back the thing because politically that made sense. So we were off and running. Next slide. Well, this was also in the background. The phrase "too cheap to meter" was Strauss, but to make the deserts bloom was Adlai Stevenson, 1952. So as early as the early 50s, all of this publicity about how you can have nuclear locomotives, nuclear cars, nuclear planes, nuclear, ships, uh, you know, was making the rounds. That all turned out to be unsound economically or nonsense. I mean, you really don't want to get in an automobile accident with a nuclear reactor, much less a train wreck or a plane crash. Even Edward Teller said that's a little nutty. And when Ed Teller tells you something nuclear doesn't make sense, you really need to pay attention. But the other ideas did make sense, the nuclear submarine. And, okay, the power plants have a mixed future, but, it seemed like it might make sense. And they did produce electricity and they worked and they were able to put them up. But because of that, everyone thought that there was going to be a tremendous link between nuclear power and advanced economies. I mean, that did not actually turn out to be the case. I mean, I think if nuclear power didn't exist, the economies of Japan and Germany, would be living proof that you get by without it. I think. I mean, they have the amount of nuclear energy in the economy. Uh, if it wasn't there, I don't know that it make that much difference. That's my call. You may have a differing view, but in any case, doesn't matter what I think. Everybody there thought that this was a killer app, and that I think, when wedded with NSC 68 and the panel of consultants' comments, made it possible for Eisenhower to come up with the idea that, well, what you do is you put a cap, but you dedicate it towards the enthusiasm for all of this. It's pretty clever. Turned out to be, in a lot of ways, not right and maybe stupid too. But it was a kind of clever combination. Yeah. All right. So let's go to the next slide. Well, we have the Answer Peace speech, which you can get. We're coming on the anniversary if you want to celebrate, December 8th. So, he says, well, we need to understand that even though you might have a vast superiority in nuclear weapons numbers and a consequential capability of devastating retaliation, it is no prevention of itself against the fearful material damage that would be inflicted. Uh, uh, and an aggressor in possession of effective minimum number of atomic weapons for a surprise attack could cause hideous damage, even against the most defended nations. I mean, what he's saying is he bought into Oppenheimer's concept, two scorpions in a bottle. I mean, here it is. It's really quite remarkable. I mean, most people would say President Eisenhower was not a champion of Oppenheimer, but here's his idea right here. It's, it's really quite, stunning. Anyway, are there, by the way, before I go any further, are there any questions?
Um, I have a question.
Yeah.
So isn't Ike around this time, he's really excited about nukes because he thinks they can be used to offset conventional disadvantages that the US has in the European theater and potentially even in the Pacific theater.
Yeah, well, he
Um,
certainly, I don't know, the more you read about him, in fairness, I'm a critic of him, but I think one of his above average perceptions was that it's okay to hype nuclear weapons to reduce the defense budget, but you don't really want to use them, do you?
yeah, so that's what I was getting at. This kind of seems like an admission of a weakness in his whole strategy, right?
Well, it made a certain amount of sense. There was a meeting in Lisbon in 1952, and I think they came out with some remarkable number of divisions everyone was going to pony up, which of course they weren't and didn't. And in lieu of that, uh, it seemed you've heard of Project Solarium, perhaps, and most recently had to do with chips or IT or something. Mike Gallagher promoted. He was a big fan of Eisenhower. I remember talking to him before he became a congressman. He was doing his PhD on Eisenhower. He kept singing the praises of Eisenhower. I said, well, I have some personal accounts of people who I know who worked with him. Not a nice guy, actually. Really not someone you wanted to work for. Uh, he couldn't hear it. He was all about it. So he named his thing Solarium. But there was a project Solarium before or right about the same time that helped sustain the argument that you should use nuclear weapons to take the place of those vast numbers of divisions that the Lisbon Agreement called for. And he had to go for it. I think he embraced it. And he certainly said things like, well, I see nuclear weapons just like another bullet. But when it came to actually using them, uh, I think he was okay threatening them up to a point, but he was pretty clear about pulling his punch too. I think he had almost any good politician thinks two opposite ideas at the same time. I think he was at least a good politician. He may not have been as the statesman people say, but he was at least a good politician. And maybe he was a statesman in certain areas. But but it wasn't in this area, I don't think. In any case, he took Oppenheimer's idea. Let's go to the next slide. Now, this guy, I actually had the privilege of meeting before he died. He was the head of the, uh, what is it? There's an office in the State Department. Oh, for gosh sakes. They write all the speeches for the Secretary of State and policy planning. There we go. The Office of Policy Planning. He was the director. I remember reaching him and asking him about a number of things. He said, "You got to be kidding. Please send me every document you have to refresh my memory." But it did refresh his memory. And he actually seemed to be a somewhat a civil servant. He looked at the proposal and he was asked to flesh it out. Well, the first thing he thought is, well, you surely don't want people to enrich or reprocess. We have to have those in multinational centers. He had a lot of reasonable restrictions on the sharing of nuclear technology that was in his study. And I'm not sure people paid enough attention to those things, but they did get some attention. And so you can read about his report a little bit in the lecture notes. Uh, Needless to say, nobody spent a lot of time implementing his suggestions, and not enough. I'm not sure that they were a complete set of restrictions or even sound thoughts entirely, but he clearly saw the problem of the civil being very close to the military. And in any case, let's go to the next slide. Now, I should mention in passing that the first meeting with the Soviets said, why would you want to spread the means of making plutonium to other countries? It'll just spread the bomb everywhere. And there really wasn't much of a response because the delegation, I don't know how savvy they were about all these things. And there was a lot of toing and froing when they came back. Is this true? I mean, are the Russians right? Well, it was an instance where your enemy was trying to help you. I mean, what they said made sense. We sort of had a hard time with that. In any case, to keep the momentum going and the pressure on the Soviets to contribute to this bank, even before the International Atomic Energy Agency had been negotiated, which took a few more years, it wasn't created until 57. They held a conference and they brought a little research reactor. And the French thought, oh, we have to do something. So what did they do? They laid out all the details on how to strip out plutonium from spent fuel, which is not exactly atoms for peace. That would help you make plutonium for bombs. That happened at this gathering, and it caused some gnawing of teeth, but it set the stage for kind of a wholesale sharing of things that with 2020 hindsight, if you're gonna fall in a ditch, is there any reason to sprint towards it? I think we sprinted toward it in this competition to put pressure. In the end, nobody gave any plutonium or uranium to any bank at all. I mean, I think we dedicated a certain amount, but it never went anywhere. All right, let's go to the next slide.